When a disgraced preacher's daughter sketched a stranger in a Colorado garden, she had no idea that single drawing would ignite a love story powerful enough to defy two families, survive public scandal, and ultimately reshape an entire town's understanding of redemption. This is the true story of Clara Rowden, a woman who transformed shame into strength and proved that sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the deepest disgrace. Welcome to our channel, dear viewers. Today I'm sharing a story that will take you on an emotional journey through the American frontier of the 1880s, a tale of forbidden love, family rebellion, and the courage to choose happiness over reputation. Please stay with us until the very end, and don't forget to comment below with your city or country so I can see how far this incredible story has traveled around the world. The summer of 1882 had been merciless to Millbrook, Colorado. Dust devils danced across the main street, and the Rocky Mountains shimmered like mirages in the distance, their snow-capped peaks offering only the cruel promise of coolness that would never reach the valley floor. It was the kind of heat that made decent folks retreat to their parlors and drew the less decent to the saloons where whiskey flowed as freely as gossip. Clara Rowden knew all about gossip. It had followed her like a shadow from Kansas, arriving in Millbrook 3 days before she did, carried on the tongues of traveling merchants and circuit riders who delighted in spreading tales of fallen women and family disgrace. Now, as she sat in the small garden behind Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, her charcoal pencil moving across rough paper with practiced precision, she could feel the weight of those whispered words settling around her shoulders like a heavy shawl. Preacher's daughter, they said, ruined by some traveling man who promised her the moon and left her with nothing but shame, cast out by her own father, no better than she ought to be. The truth, as Clara had learned in her 22 years, was always more complicated than gossip allowed. But complexity didn't sell newspapers or fill the empty hours between Sunday services, so she had stopped trying to explain herself. Better to let them talk while she worked on building something new from the ashes of her old life. The garden was her sanctuary, a small patch of green that Mrs. Henderson tended with the fierce devotion of a woman who understood that beauty required constant vigilance in a harsh world. Morning glories climbed the wooden fence in defiant spirals of purple and blue, while roses bloomed with stubborn persistence despite the drought. It was here that Clara came each afternoon when the other boarders were either working or napping to practice the one skill that had never abandoned her drawing. Her fingers were stained with charcoal, her simple blue dress marked with smudges where she'd absently wiped her hands, but Clara didn't care. For the first time in months, she felt something approaching peace. The sketch taking shape on her paper was of the garden itself, the way afternoon light filtered through the cottonwood leaves, casting dappled shadows on the ground where a tabby cat dozed in the warmth. She was so absorbed in capturing the play of light and shadow that she didn't hear the gate's rusty hinges announce a visitor. It wasn't until a deep voice said, "Excuse me, miss," that she looked up, startled, her pencil leaving an unintended mark across her work. The man standing at the garden's entrance was tall and lean, with the kind of posture that spoke of good breeding and confidence in his place in the world. His dark hair was neatly combed despite the heat, and his brown eyes held a warmth that seemed at odds with the fine cut of his clothes. Everything about him, from his polished boots to the gold watch chain visible across his vest, proclaimed him a gentleman of means. Exactly the sort of man who would have no business speaking to a woman of her reputation. "I'm sorry to disturb you," he continued, removing his hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "I was looking for Mrs. Henderson. I heard she might have a room available." Clara set down her pencil, acutely aware of her stained fingers and the way her hair had escaped its pins in the heat. "She's gone to town for supplies," she managed, hating the way her voice sounded small and uncertain. "Won't be back until evening." He nodded, but made no move to leave. Instead, his gaze drifted to the sketch pad in her lap. "I hope you don't mind my saying so, but that's quite remarkable work." Heat that had nothing to do with the weather flooded Clara's cheeks. In her embarrassment, she'd forgotten to turn the pad away from view. "It's nothing special," she said, quickly closing the cover. "Just practice." "May I?" He gestured toward the wooden bench where she sat, his request so polite and unexpected that Clara found herself nodding before she'd fully processed the words. As he settled beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance, Clara caught the scent of cedar and something crisp and clean like mountain air. Up close, she could see that his eyes weren't just brown but flecked with gold, and that his hands, though clearly belonging to a man who'd never done manual labor, were strong and well-shaped. "I'm Nathaniel Harlow," he said, offering his hand in a gesture that would have scandalized the proper ladies of Millbrook if they'd witnessed it. "My family owns the Double H Ranch north of town." Clara stared at his outstretched hand, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew that name. Everyone in the territory knew the Harlows. They were cattle barons, practically royalty in this corner of Colorado, with a spread that stretched from the foothills to the river valley. Nathaniel Harlow was heir to all of it, destined to marry some rancher's daughter and produce a new generation of cattle kings. He was also waiting for her to respond, his hand still extended, his expression patient and kind. "Clara," she said, finally taking his hand in her own. The contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, warm and electric. Clara Rowden. If her name meant anything to him, if he'd heard the gossip, his face didn't show it. "Miss Rowden," he said, his thumb brushing lightly across her knuckles before he released her hand. "Would you mind terribly if I asked to see your work? I have something of an appreciation for art, though I'm afraid my own efforts rarely progress beyond stick figures." The self-deprecating humor in his voice made Clara smile despite herself. "You wouldn't want to see these," she protested. "They're just sketches, nothing like real art." "I think," Nathaniel said gently, "that you might be surprised by what constitutes real art. Sometimes the most honest work comes from practice, not performance." There was something in the way he said it, a depth that suggested he understood more about hiding one's true self than his privileged appearance might suggest. Before Clara could lose her nerve, she opened the sketch pad and turned it toward him. Nathaniel studied the drawing with the serious attention she might have expected him to give a business contract. His eyes moved across the paper, taking in every line and shadow, and Clara found herself holding her breath as she waited for his verdict. "This is extraordinary," he said finally, and the genuine wonder in his voice made Clara's chest tight with an emotion she couldn't name. "The way you've captured the light, it's like looking through a window. I can almost feel the warmth of the sun." "You're being kind," Clara murmured, but she couldn't quite suppress the flush of pleasure his words brought. "I'm being honest," Nathaniel corrected. "May I see the others?" For the next hour they sat side by side on the bench, while Clara turned pages and Nathaniel offered observations that proved he hadn't been modest about his appreciation for art. He understood composition and technique in ways that suggested education and study, but more than that, he seemed to see what she'd been trying to capture in each piece, the emotion beneath the careful lines. "This one," he said, pausing at a sketch of the boarding house's narrow staircase, where afternoon light slanted through a window to illuminate dust motes dancing in the air. "There's such loneliness in it, but also hope somehow, as if the light is promising something better beyond the next step." Clara's breath caught. She'd drawn that staircase a dozen times, trying to capture exactly that feeling, the sense of being caught between despair and possibility that had defined her first weeks in Millbrook. That he could see, it could understand what she'd been trying to express, seemed impossible. "How did you know?" she whispered. Nathaniel's smile was gentle, touched with a sadness that made him seem suddenly younger. "I suppose because I've stood on stairs like that myself. Different circumstances, perhaps, but the feeling—" He shrugged. "The feeling is universal, isn't it? That sense of being suspended between what was and what might be." Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition that went deeper than polite conversation between strangers. Clara found herself studying his face, noting the fine lines around his eyes that spoke of squinting into distant horizons, the slight tension in his jaw that suggested burdens carried in silence. "What brings you to town, Mr. Harlow?" she asked, though part of her already suspected the answer. Young men of his station didn't come to Millbrook looking for boarding house rooms unless they were running from something. Nathaniel's laugh held no humor. "Family obligations." He said the words clipped and careful. "My parents have decided it's time I fulfill my duty to the Harlow name. They've arranged for me to court the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a perfectly suitable young lady who will make an excellent wife and mother to the next generation of cattle barons." "But you don't love her," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "I've never even met her," Nathaniel admitted. "The arrangement was made between our fathers over brandy and cigars. Miss Patterson is reportedly accomplished in all the domestic arts, has an impeccable reputation, and will bring a substantial dowry to the marriage. What more could a man want?" The bitterness in his voice was barely concealed, and Clara felt an unexpected stab of sympathy. She'd always imagined that wealth and position would shield a person from the kind of constraints that had shaped her own life, but perhaps cages came in different forms. "So you were hiding in town until the inevitable?" she asked. "Something like that." Nathaniel turned to look at her, his brown eyes serious. "What about you, Miss Rowden? What brings an artist to Millbrook?" Clara's hands tightened on her sketchpad. This was the moment when honest conversation would end, when he would learn the truth about her past and remember his position, his reputation, the impossibility of being seen with a woman like her. "I'm hiding too," she said quietly, "from mistakes and consequences and people who think they know my story better than I do." "And do they know your story, I mean?" Clara considered lying, spinning some tale that would preserve whatever good opinion he might have formed of her, but something in his manner, the way he'd looked at her art, really looked at it as if it mattered, made her choose honesty instead. "Parts of it," she said. "They know that I was foolish enough to trust a man who promised me everything and delivered nothing but scandal. They know my father chose his reputation over his daughter. They know I came here with barely enough money for a week's lodging and no references, no family, no prospects beyond whatever work I can find." She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "What they don't know is that I'm grateful for all of it, every painful, humiliating moment that brought me here." Nathaniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "Grateful. For the first time in my life, I'm free to make my own choices," Clara explained. "Good or bad, wise or foolish, they're mine. I may not have much, but what I have belongs to me alone. There's something to be said for that kind of independence, even if it comes at a high price." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the morning glories climbing the garden fence. "You're braver than I am," he said finally. "I'm desperate," Clara corrected. "Desperation makes cowards do courageous things." "Or it reveals the courage that was always there," Nathaniel suggested. He turned back to her, and something in his expression had changed, grown more intent. "Miss Rowden, Clara, would you consider drawing something for me?" Of course," Clara stammered, surprised by the request. "What did you have in mind?" "Myself," he said simply. "I know it's an odd request, but I've never had my portrait done by a real artist. And I suspect," he added with a smile that made her heart skip, "that you would see things others might miss." Clara's hands were trembling as she turned to a fresh page in her sketchpad. Having him sit still while she studied his features captured the planes of his face and the expressions that crossed it. It seemed impossibly intimate, far more personal than their conversation had been. "How should I?" she began, then stopped, feeling foolish. She'd drawn faces before, dozens of them, but never with the subject watching her so intently. "However feels natural to you," Nathaniel said. "I trust your artistic judgment." She started with the basic shape of his face, the strong line of his jaw, and the way his hair fell across his forehead. But as her pencil moved across the paper, she found herself drawn to details that spoke of character rather than mere appearance, the way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners, as if he were perpetually on the verge of smiling, the small scar on his left temple that spoke of childhood adventures, the manner in which he held his shoulders straight, but not rigid, confident, without arrogance. "Tell me about your family," she said as she worked. Finding that conversation helped steady her hands. Nathaniel shifted slightly, his expression growing more serious. "There's not much to tell that would interest you. My father built the ranch from nothing, started with a few head of cattle and a stubbornness that impressed even the mountain men. My mother came from back east Boston society, and I think she's never quite forgiven Colorado for not being more civilized. And you? Are you more like your father or your mother?" "Neither, according to them," Nathaniel said with a rueful smile. "Father thinks I'm too soft for ranching, too interested in books and art and impractical things. Mother despairs of my manners and my tendency to speak to people regardless of their station. They both agree I'm a disappointment to the family name." Clara's pencil paused. "You don't strike me as disappointing." "You don't know me well enough yet," Nathaniel said, but his tone was light teasing rather than bitter. "I know you stopped to compliment a stranger's artwork," Clara said. "I know you asked permission before sitting down, and you've spent the better part of an hour talking to a woman who most people cross the street to avoid. That tells me something about your character." "Perhaps it tells you something about your own worth," Nathaniel suggested quietly. "Maybe the people who cross the street are the ones with poor judgment." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they were kind. She'd grown so accustomed to thinking of herself as damaged goods, as someone whose mistakes had fundamentally altered her value, that the idea of her worth being intrinsic, rather than dependent on others' opinions, was almost revolutionary. "You're very generous," she managed. "I'm honest," Nathaniel said, echoing his earlier words. "It's a family failing, apparently." They fell into comfortable silence while Clara continued to work. The afternoon light was beginning to shift, painting the garden in warmer tones, and she found herself racing to capture not just Nathaniel's features, but the quality of light on his face, the way the shadows defined his cheekbones, and the warmth in his eyes. When she finally set down her pencil, her hand was cramped and her neck stiff from concentration, but the portrait looking back at her from the page was the best work she'd ever done. She'd managed to capture not just Nathaniel's appearance, but something essential about him, the intelligence in his gaze, the hint of restlessness in the set of his mouth, the fundamental decency that seemed to radiate from his very posture. "May I see?" Nathaniel asked. Clara hesitated suddenly, uncertain. Drawing him had felt like discovering something private about him, something intimate, that perhaps shouldn't be shared even with its subject. But he was waiting patiently, and she couldn't think of a reason to refuse without seeming foolish. She turned the sketchpad toward him, watching his face for his reaction. Nathaniel's expression went through several changes as he studied the portrait: surprise, recognition, something that might have been wonder. Finally, he looked up at her, and his eyes were bright, with an emotion she couldn't quite identify. "Is that really how you see me?" he asked softly. Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. "I look—" He paused, searching for words. "I look like someone worth knowing." "You are someone worth knowing," Clara said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. Something shifted in the air between them, a charge that made Clara's skin prickle with awareness. Nathaniel was looking at her as if he were seeing her for the first time, his gaze moving from her face to her hands and back again, and she felt suddenly self-conscious about her stained fingers and her simple dress. "Clara," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, weighted with possibility. "Would you— that is, I was wondering if you might be free tomorrow afternoon. I know a place where the light is extraordinary, perfect for an artist." Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew what he was asking, and she knew what it would mean if she said yes. A woman in her position had no business entertaining the attentions of a man like Nathaniel Harlow, no matter how kind or genuine he seemed. It was a recipe for heartbreak at best, scandal at worst. But as she looked into his eyes, warm and hopeful and somehow vulnerable, she found herself nodding before common sense could intervene. "I'd like that," she said quietly. Nathaniel's smile was radiant, transforming his entire face. "Shall we say 2 o'clock? I'll meet you here if that's acceptable." "That's acceptable," Clara agreed, though she was already wondering what madness had possessed her. The sound of wagon wheels on gravel announced Mrs. Henderson's return from town, and both Clara and Nathaniel turned toward the gate as the older woman appeared, her arms full of packages and her face flushed with heat and exertion. "Oh!" Mrs. Henderson stopped short when she saw Nathaniel, her eyes widening with recognition. "Mr. Harlow, I didn't expect, that is, Clara didn't mention." "Mrs. Henderson," Nathaniel said, rising smoothly and offering a polite bow, "I was hoping to inquire about a room. Miss Rowden was kind enough to inform me you'd gone to town, so I took the liberty of waiting." Mrs. Henderson's gaze darted between Nathaniel and Clara, taking in the sketch pad, their proximity on the bench, the subtle tension in the air. Clara could practically see the calculations running through the older woman's mind. The social gulf between them, the potential for gossip, the danger to her boarding house's reputation. "I see," Mrs. Henderson said carefully. "And you're looking for accommodation because family obligations require me to spend some time in town," Nathaniel said smoothly. "I thought it might be more comfortable than the hotel, and I've heard excellent things about your establishment." It was diplomatically said, and Mrs. Henderson visibly relaxed. Whatever else might be happening in her garden, at least her business reputation remained intact. "Well, I do have a room available," she said. "Top floor facing the mountains, very quiet and respectable. My boarders are all working people, you understand. I run a proper house." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Nathaniel assured her. "Would it be possible to see the room?" "Of course." Mrs. Henderson set down her packages and smoothed her skirts. "Clara, dear, would you mind taking these supplies to the kitchen?" It was a clear dismissal, and Clara understood the message. Whatever had passed between her and Nathaniel in the garden, it couldn't continue under Mrs. Henderson's roof. The older woman had her own reputation to consider. "Of course," Clara said, gathering the packages. As she passed Nathaniel, he caught her hand briefly, so quickly that Mrs. Henderson couldn't have seen. "Until tomorrow," he murmured, his thumb brushing across her knuckles, in a gesture that sent warmth shooting up her arm. "Until tomorrow," Clara agreed, and hurried into the house before Mrs. Henderson could see the flush that was surely staining her cheeks. From the kitchen window, she watched Nathaniel follow Mrs. Henderson up the external staircase to the second floor, his tall frame moving with easy grace. As if sensing her gaze, he glanced back toward the house, and even from a distance, Clara could see his smile. She pressed her hands to her cheeks, trying to calm the wild beating of her heart. In the space of a single afternoon, her carefully ordered existence had been turned upside down. She was 22 years old, ruined in the eyes of society, with no prospects beyond the meager wages she might earn doing seamstress work or laundry. Nathaniel Harlow was heir to one of the largest ranches in Colorado, expected to marry advantageously and produce children who would continue the family legacy. There was no future in whatever was happening between them. She knew that with the cold certainty of experience. But as she looked down at the sketchpad still clutched in her hands, at the portrait that had somehow captured more than just his physical features, Clara found that she didn't care about futures or consequences or the inevitable heartbreak that lay ahead. For the first time since her disgrace, she felt truly alive. And whatever the cost, she wasn't ready to give that feeling up. Tomorrow couldn't come soon enough. The evening passed in a blur of routine tasks, helping Mrs. Henderson prepare dinner, mending a tear in her second-best dress, writing a letter to her sister in Kansas that she would never send. But underneath the familiar activities, Clara's thoughts circled endlessly around the afternoon in the garden, replaying every word and gesture until she could recite the entire conversation from memory. When the other boarders gathered in the parlor after dinner, Mr. Thompson with his newspaper, Mrs. Cassidy with her endless knitting, young Tommy Fletcher with his penny dreadfuls, Clara excused herself early and climbed the narrow stairs to her small room under the eaves. The space was barely large enough for a bed, a washstand, and a trunk, but it was hers alone, and she treasured the privacy it offered. She set the sketch pad on her pillow and lit the single candle that was all she allowed herself each evening, then sat on the edge of the bed to study the portrait by flickering light. Had she really captured something essential about Nathaniel, or was she seeing only what she wanted to see? The face looking back at her from the paper seemed both familiar and strange, as if she'd drawn not the man she'd met, but the man he might become under different circumstances. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. "Clara," Mrs. Henderson's voice was carefully neutral. "Might I have a word?" Clara closed the sketch pad quickly and opened the door. Mrs. Henderson stood in the narrow hallway, her expression kind but troubled. "May I come in for a moment?" Clara stepped aside, and the older woman entered the small space, her presence somehow making it seem even tinier than usual. "I wanted to speak with you about this afternoon," Mrs. Henderson said without preamble. "About Mr. Harlow." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "If you're concerned about propriety, I'm concerned about you," Mrs. Henderson interrupted gently. "Clara, dear, you're a lovely girl with real talent, but you must understand your position. Men like Nathaniel Harlow, they don't marry women like us. They may dally, they may even fancy themselves in love for a time, but in the end, they marry within their own class." The words hit Clara like cold water, all the more painful for being true. "I'm not expecting marriage," she said quietly. "I'm not expecting anything at all." "Aren't you?" Mrs. Henderson's voice was compassionate but firm. "I saw the way you looked at him and the way he looked at you. I've been managing this boarding house for 15 years, Clara. I've seen what happens when girls in your position forget themselves with men in his." Clara sat heavily on the bed, the sketch pad sliding to the floor. "What would you have me do? Refuse to speak to him? Lock myself in my room whenever he's in the garden?" "I would have you be careful," Mrs. Henderson said, settling beside her on the narrow bed. "Guard your heart, child. Enjoy his company if you must. But remember who you are and who he is. Remember that when this little adventure of his is over, he'll return to his family and his duty, and you'll still be here trying to build a life from whatever pieces are left." Clara nodded, though the words felt like stones in her chest. "I understand. Do you?" Mrs. Henderson studied her face in the candlelight. "Because understanding and accepting are two different things entirely." After the older woman left, Clara sat alone in the flickering candlelight, staring at the sketch pad on the floor. Mrs. Henderson was right, of course. She was being foolish, setting herself up for heartbreak by entertaining even the possibility of friendship with Nathaniel Harlow. But as she picked up the sketch pad and looked once more at the portrait, Clara found her resolve wavering. Tomorrow afternoon she would see him again. They would walk together in the extraordinary light he'd promised, and she would try to capture some small piece of beauty on paper. It might be foolish, it was certainly dangerous, but for a woman who had lost everything else, the chance to feel alive again seemed worth almost any risk. She blew out the candle and lay down in the darkness, the sketch pad pressed against her chest like a talisman. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. Tonight she had hope, and that was more than she'd had in months. Outside her window, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the darkness, Nathaniel Harlow was perhaps lying awake as well, thinking of afternoon light and charcoal-stained fingers, and the unexpected gift of finding beauty in the most unlikely places. The next morning arrived with a clarity that seemed to mock Clara's sleepless night. She had lain awake until dawn, alternating between anticipation and dread, replaying Mrs. Henderson's warnings until they echoed like church bells in her mind. When she finally rose, her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand showed dark circles beneath her eyes and a pallor that spoke of exhaustion. She dressed with unusual care, choosing her best day dress, a simple gray cotton with tiny pearl buttons that had once belonged to her mother. It was modest but well made, and the color brought out the blue in her eyes. As she pinned her hair into a neat chignon, Clara caught herself wondering what Nathaniel would think of her appearance, then forced herself to stop such foolishness. Breakfast in the boarding house dining room was a trial of sideways glances and barely concealed whispers. Word of Nathaniel's arrival had spread through the house like wildfire, and Clara could feel the weight of speculation pressing down on her shoulders. Mrs. Cassidy made pointed comments about certain people forgetting their place, while Mr. Thompson rustled his newspaper with unnecessary force every time Clara moved. "Pay them no mind," whispered Sarah Murphy, the young Irish girl who worked at the millinery shop. She slipped into the chair beside Clara, her green eyes bright with curiosity and sympathy. "They're just jealous that such a fine gentleman paid you attention." "There's nothing to be jealous of," Clara replied quietly, stirring her coffee without drinking it. Mr. Harlow simply admired my sketching. It was a perfectly innocent conversation." Sarah's laugh was soft but knowing. "Innocent, was it? Then why haven't you touched your breakfast, and why do you keep glancing toward the door every few seconds?" Before Clara could formulate a response, the man himself appeared in the doorway. Nathaniel had obviously risen early and spent time outdoors. His hair held the slight dampness of recent washing, and his clothes, simpler than yesterday's finery, bore the faint scent of sage and mountain air. His eyes found Clara immediately, and the smile that spread across his face sent warmth flooding through her chest. "Good morning," he said, addressing the room in general but looking only at Clara. "Mrs. Henderson, might I trouble you for a cup of coffee? I find myself in need of fortification before facing the day." Mrs. Henderson bustled forward with forced cheer, clearly aware of the undercurrents flowing through her dining room. "Of course, Mr. Harlow. Sarah, dear, would you fetch another cup from the kitchen?" As Sarah hurried away, Nathaniel took the vacant chair across from Clara, seemingly oblivious to the tension his presence had created. "I trust you slept well, Miss Rowden." "Quite well, thank you," Clara lied, acutely aware of every eye in the room fixed upon their exchange. "And you? I hope you found your accommodation satisfactory." "More than satisfactory. The view from my window is spectacular. The mountains seem close enough to touch." He accepted his coffee from Sarah with a grateful nod, then turned back to Clara. "I was wondering if you might be free for that walk we discussed. The weather appears perfect for artistic endeavors." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Mrs. Henderson's mantel clock. Clara felt the weight of disapproval pressing down on her from all sides, but when she looked into Nathaniel's eyes, the rest of the world seemed to fade away. "I believe I could spare some time this afternoon," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Excellent. Shall we say 2 o'clock as planned?" Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak again. The simple exchange felt charged with significance, as if they were negotiating terms for something far more momentous than an afternoon walk. After Nathaniel finished his coffee and excused himself presumably to attend to whatever business had brought him to town, the dining room erupted in barely suppressed murmurs. Clara excused herself as quickly as politeness allowed and fled to the garden, seeking refuge among the morning glories and roses. She tried to focus on her sketching, but her hands trembled too badly to produce anything worthwhile. Every sound from the street made her heart race, wondering if it might be Nathaniel returning early. The hours until 2 o'clock stretched before her like an eternity. At 1:30, she finally gave up any pretense of normalcy and went upstairs to change. She chose her walking dress, a practical brown wool that wouldn't show dust, and tied her hair back with a ribbon that had once been her mother's. As she gathered her sketching supplies, Clara caught sight of herself in the mirror and was surprised by what she saw. Her cheeks were flushed with anticipation, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. For the first time in months, she looked truly alive. Nathaniel was waiting in the garden when she descended, leaning against the wooden fence with easy grace. He had changed into riding clothes, leather boots, canvas trousers, and a white shirt open at the collar, and Clara felt her breath catch at the sight of him. There was something about his casual attire that made him seem more real, more accessible than the perfectly dressed gentleman of yesterday. "Are you ready for an adventure?" he asked, pushing away from the fence with a smile that made her heart flutter. "That depends," Clara replied, struggling to match his light tone. "What sort of adventure did you have in mind?" "Nothing too scandalous," Nathaniel assured her, though his eyes held a mischievous glint. "Just a walk to one of my favorite places. I think you'll find it worth the effort." They set off together down the dusty main street past the general store where Mrs. Patterson looked up from her displays with obvious curiosity, past the saloon where a few early patrons lounged on the porch, past the small white church where Clara's father might have preached if circumstances had been different. She was acutely aware of the attention their passage attracted, but Nathaniel seemed genuinely oblivious to the stares and whispers that followed in their wake. "Tell me about your art," he said, as they turned onto a path that led away from town toward the foothills. "When did you first know you wanted to draw?" Clara considered the question as they walked, her skirts brushing against the tall grass that lined the path. "I'm not sure I ever chose it," she said finally. "It was simply something I did the way other children might sing or dance. My mother encouraged it when I was small. She said it was a useful accomplishment for a young lady." "And your father?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with all the things Clara hadn't said about her past. She could have deflected, changed the subject, but something in Nathaniel's manner invited honesty. "My father believed that art was vanity," she said quietly, "a distraction from more important duties. He tolerated my sketching only because my mother insisted. And after she died," Clara shrugged, not trusting herself to finish the sentence. "How old were you when you lost her?" 14. "Old enough to understand that I was losing the only person who truly understood me, young enough to believe that somehow I could have prevented it." Nathaniel stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "You blamed yourself for her death. For not being enough to make her want to fight harder to stay." Clara admitted the words, tumbling out before she could stop them. "For not being the perfect daughter she deserved. For every harsh word I'd ever spoken to her, every time I'd taken her love for granted." "Clara," Nathaniel's voice was gentle, but there was steel beneath the softness. "You were a child. Children aren't responsible for their parents' mortality any more than they're responsible for the weather or the turning of the seasons." "Perhaps not," Clara said, starting to walk again, "but understanding something and feeling it are two different things entirely." They continued in comfortable silence for a while, the path winding upward through stands of aspen and pine. The air grew thinner and cooler as they climbed, and Clara found herself grateful for the exercise after days of restless confinement to the boarding house. "What about you?" she asked eventually. "Have you always known you'd inherit the ranch?" Nathaniel's laugh held little humor. "Ways, from the moment I could walk, I was being groomed to take over the Double H. Taught to ride before I could properly read, schooled in cattle breeding, and range management before I'd mastered my multiplication tables." "But you wanted something different." It wasn't a question, and Nathaniel didn't treat it as one. "I wanted to see the world beyond Colorado. I wanted to study art and literature, maybe even try my hand at writing. I had dreams of traveling to Europe, seeing the great galleries and museums." He shrugged, his expression rueful. "Foolish dreams, according to my father. Impractical nonsense that would only distract me from my duties." "Are they foolish, I mean?" Nathaniel considered the question as they rounded a bend in the path. Ahead of them, the trees began to thin, revealing glimpses of a meadow beyond. Perhaps. But they're my dreams, and I sometimes think that makes them valuable regardless of their practicality. Clara thought of her own abandoned dreams of art school in Denver, of seeing her work displayed in real galleries, of making a living doing something she loved instead of something she merely endured. "I understand," she said softly. "I believe you do," Nathaniel replied, and there was something in his voice that made Clara glance at him sideways. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her cheeks warm, as if he were seeing not just who she was, but who she might become. The path emerged into a meadow so beautiful that Clara stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in wonder. Wild flowers carpeted the ground in brilliant splashes of color. Indian paintbrush and lupine columbine and mountain asters, while beyond them the land dropped away to reveal a sweeping vista of the valley below. Millbrook looked like a child's toy village. From this height, its buildings neat and orderly against the backdrop of rolling grassland. But it was the light that truly took Clara's breath away. The afternoon sun filtered through high clouds, cast everything in a golden glow that seemed to make the very air shimmer. Shadows played across the meadow in constantly shifting patterns, and the mountains beyond rose like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with silver and rose. "Oh," Clara breathed, her hand moving instinctively to the sketching supplies she carried. "Oh, this is extraordinary." "I thought you might appreciate it," Nathaniel said, and the quiet satisfaction in his voice told her he'd been hoping for exactly this reaction. "I discovered this place when I was 12, running away from a particularly onerous Latin lesson. I've been coming here ever since when I need to think." Clara was already unpacking her supplies, her artist's eye cataloging the interplay of light and shadow, the way the distant mountains created layers of color, from deep purple to pale blue. "How did you know?" she asked, settling onto a flat boulder that seemed positioned perfectly for viewing the scene before them. "How did you know this was exactly what I needed to see?" Nathaniel settled beside her, careful to maintain a proper distance, but close enough that she could catch his scent, cedar and sage and something uniquely him, because he said simply, "It's exactly what I needed to see the first time I came here. Sometimes beauty is the only thing that makes sense when everything else feels impossible." Clara began to sketch, her pencil moving quickly across the paper as she tried to capture the essence of the scene before the light changed. But she found herself glancing at Nathaniel as much as at the landscape, noting the way his hair caught the golden light, the relaxed set of his shoulders as he leaned back against the rock, the distant expression in his eyes as he gazed out over the valley. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, her pencil never pausing in its movement. "The first time I brought a girl here," Nathaniel said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "Not that is, I don't make a habit of—" He stopped, his cheeks reddening slightly. "What I mean is, I've never shared this place with anyone before." Clara's pencil stilled. "Never. Never. It was always my secret, my refuge. But yesterday, when I saw your work, saw the way you understood light and shadow," he shrugged, seeming almost embarrassed by his own words, "I wanted to share it with someone who would see it the way I do." The simple honesty of his admission made Clara's chest tight with emotion. She set down her pencil and turned to face him fully. "Why me, Nathaniel? Really, why me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see straight through to her soul. "Because," he said finally, "you understand what it means to lose everything and still find beauty in the world. Because you're brave enough to start over when starting over seems impossible. Because when you look at something, really look at it, you see not just what it is, but what it could be." "You don't know me well enough to say those things," Clara protested, though her voice was barely above a whisper. "Don't I?" Nathaniel shifted closer, his brown eyes never leaving her face. "I know you've been hurt badly enough that you've rebuilt your entire life around the pieces that were left. I know you're talented enough that a stranger would stop to admire your work, brave enough to leave everything familiar behind, and generous enough to spend an afternoon with a man who's probably bringing nothing but trouble into your life. Is that what you're doing? Bringing trouble? Nathaniel's smile was rueful. Almost certainly. I'm not free to offer you anything real, Clara. My life, my future, it all belongs to other people's expectations. But I'm selfish enough to want these moments anyway, even knowing they can't lead anywhere. Clara felt something crack open in her chest, a painful flowering of hope and desire and impossible longing. She should walk away now, she knew, should gather her sketching supplies and return to the boarding house and the safe, circumscribed life she'd been building there. Should remember Mrs. Henderson's warnings and her own hard-won wisdom about the consequences of trusting the wrong man. Instead, she reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the rock between them. What if I'm selfish too? Nathaniel's fingers closed around hers, warm and strong and startlingly real. Then perhaps we can be selfish together just for a little while. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks, painting the meadow in deeper shades of gold and amber. Clara tried to return to her sketching, but found herself distracted by Nathaniel's presence beside her, by the weight of his gaze when he thought she wasn't looking, by the way her skin seemed to hum with awareness whenever he moved. "Tell me about Kansas," he said eventually, his voice cutting through the afternoon stillness. Clara's hand tightened on her pencil. "What would you like to know? What it was like growing up there, whether you were happy?" Clara considered the question, her pencil moving absently across the paper as she thought. "I was happy enough, I suppose. My father was strict, but not unkind. At least not then. My mother made our house feel like a home, filled it with music and laughter and the smell of her baking. I had friends at church lessons with the schoolmaster dreams of what my life might become. What changed? Everything. Nothing. Both." Clara sighed, setting down her pencil to look out over the valley. "My mother's death changed my father in ways I didn't understand at the time. He became harder, more rigid in his beliefs, more convinced that every pleasure was a step toward damnation. He remarried eventually a woman who saw me as competition for his attention and affection." "And the man who ruined you?" Nathaniel asked gently. "What was he like?" Clara felt heat flood her cheeks, but something in Nathaniel's manner, the complete absence of judgment, the genuine concern in his voice, made her want to tell him the truth. "Charming," she said finally. "Handsome and well-spoken and everything a young woman dreams of in a suitor. He was a traveling preacher come to hold a revival in our town. He spoke of God's love and redemption, of the beauty he saw in every soul. And she laughed bitterly. "I was foolish enough to believe he saw something special in mine." "What happened?" "The usual story, I suppose. Secret meetings, whispered promises, a proposal that would come as soon as he'd established himself in a permanent congregation somewhere. He said he loved me, said he wanted to marry me, said all the things I was desperate to hear." Clara's voice grew quieter, more controlled. "When I finally gave him what he wanted, he was gone within the week. No goodbye, no explanation, just a note saying he'd been called to serve elsewhere." Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his hand still holding hers. "And your father found the note before I did, found other evidence of my indiscretion, called me a whore in front of half the congregation, and disowned me the same day." Clara's voice was steady now, the pain of those memories dulled by time and repetition. His new wife suggested I might find a fresh start somewhere far from Kansas, and he agreed so enthusiastically that I understood how thoroughly I'd been erased from his life. "I'm sorry," Nathaniel said simply. "You deserved better from all of them." "Did I?" Clara turned to look at him, genuine curiosity in her eyes. "I made choices, Nathaniel. Foolish, naive choices, but choices nonetheless. Perhaps I got exactly what I deserved." "No." His voice was firm, almost angry. "You made the mistake of trusting someone who proved unworthy of that trust. You made the mistake of believing in love when the object of that love was selfish and cruel. Those aren't sins, Clara. They're the natural errors of a generous heart. The fierce protectiveness in his voice made something flutter in Clara's chest. When was the last time someone had defended her, even to herself? When was the last time someone had suggested that her mistakes might be forgivable, that her heart might be worth protecting? "You're very kind," she said softly. "I'm honest." Nathaniel replied, echoing his words from the day before. "There's a difference." The light was beginning to change as the sun sank lower, casting longer shadows across the meadow and painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and rose. Clara returned to her sketching with renewed focus, trying to capture the way the light transformed everything. It touched the way colors deepened and shifted as the day waned. "May I watch you work?" Nathaniel asked. "I promise not to distract you." Clara smiled despite herself. "You're already distracting me," she admitted. "But yes, you may watch." She was acutely aware of his gaze as she worked, of the way he leaned slightly forward to better see her technique, of his quiet intake of breath when she managed to capture a particularly difficult effect of light on distant rock. It should have made her self-conscious, but instead she found his attention oddly liberating. For the first time in her life, someone was watching her create, not to judge or criticize, but simply to appreciate the process itself. "You're remarkable," he said quietly when she paused to study her work. "The way you see things, the way you translate what you see onto paper, it's like magic." "It's just practice," Clara protested, though his words sent warmth flooding through her. "Anyone could learn to do what I do." "No," Nathaniel said firmly. "Anyone could learn technique, perhaps. But this—" He gestured toward her sketch, where the meadow lived again, in shades of graphite and charcoal, somehow more beautiful than reality. "This comes from somewhere deeper than technique. This comes from the soul." Clara looked down at her work, trying to see it through his eyes. It was good, she admitted to herself, perhaps better than good. The scene she'd captured seemed to glow with life, and looking at it she could almost feel the mountain air on her skin, almost hear the whisper of wind through the grass. "I never thought of it that way," she said honestly. "Then you haven't been looking at yourself clearly," Nathaniel said. "You have a gift, Clara, a real gift. And someday when the world is ready to see what I see, you're going to be celebrated for it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and longing. Clara wanted to believe them, wanted to imagine a future where her art might matter to more than just herself. But dreams like that seemed as distant as the mountains on the horizon, beautiful, but ultimately unreachable. "We should head back," she said finally, though every part of her rebelled against the idea. "It'll be dark soon, and Mrs. Henderson will worry." Nathaniel nodded, though his reluctance was as obvious as her own. "Of course, I wouldn't want to damage your reputation any further." As they packed up her supplies and prepared to leave the meadow, Clara felt the weight of reality settling back onto her shoulders. This afternoon had been a gift, a few hours of beauty and connection, and the dangerous luxury of feeling understood. But now they had to return to the world of boarding houses and gossip and the impossible gulf between their stations. The walk back to town passed too quickly, though they lingered whenever possible, stopping to examine interesting rock formations, pausing to watch a hawk circle overhead, taking the longer path through the aspens, where dappled light created patterns that made Clara wish she had time to sketch them all. They talked about art and literature, about the books they'd read, and the places they'd seen, and Clara found herself marveling at how easy it was to talk to him, how natural their conversation felt, despite everything that should have made it impossible. As they reached the outskirts of Millbrook, their steps slowed as if by mutual agreement. Neither wanted to break the spell that the afternoon had woven around them. Neither wanted to return to being merely Miss Rowden and Mr. Harlow, the disgraced preacher's daughter and the cattle baron's heir, who had no business being seen together. "Clara," Nathaniel said, as they paused at the gate to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, "would you—" That is, I was wondering if you might consider having dinner with me tomorrow evening. There's a place I know quiet and respectable where we could talk without interruption. Clara's heart leaped at the invitation, even as her mind catalogued all the reasons she should refuse. A public dinner would be impossible to hide, impossible to explain away as mere coincidence. It would announce to all of Millbrook that something was happening between them, something that could only end in scandal and heartbreak. I don't think that would be wise, she said carefully, though the words felt like stones in her throat. Probably not, Nathaniel agreed. But would you consider it anyway? Clara looked up into his face, seeing her own longing reflected in his brown eyes. Tomorrow night seemed impossibly far away and terrifyingly close all at once. Where? She heard herself ask. The hotel dining room, 7 o'clock. I'll tell them to prepare a private table by the window, nothing improper, just private enough for conversation. The whole town will know within an hour, Clara warned. Let them know, Nathaniel said, and there was something almost defiant in his voice. Let them think what they want to think. I'm tired of living my life according to other people's expectations. Clara stared at him, seeing something new in his expression, a resolution that hadn't been there before, a willingness to risk consequences that surprised her. What's changed? She asked. You, he said simply. Meeting you, seeing your work, understanding that there are people in this world who create beauty despite everything that tries to destroy it. It's changed something in me, Clara. I don't want to waste any more time pretending to be the man my parents want me to be, instead of discovering who I actually am. The words hit Clara like a physical blow, not because they were unwelcome, but because they were too welcome, too full of the very hope she'd been trying to protect herself against. Nathaniel, I know what you're going to say, he interrupted. I know all the reasons this is impossible, but impossibility doesn't make it less real, does it? What I feel for you, what I think you might feel for me, it's real, regardless of what happens next. Clara's hands were trembling as she fumbled with the gate latch. 7 o'clock, she said without looking at him. I'll be there. Clara, his voice stopped her as she started up the path toward the house. Thank you. For this afternoon, for your trust, for being exactly who you are. Thank you. She nodded without turning around, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried into the house before her resolve could crumble entirely. From her window upstairs, she watched Nathaniel stand by the gate for a long moment, his face turned up toward her room, before finally walking away into the gathering dusk. That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with anticipation and terror in equal measure. Tomorrow evening she would have dinner with Nathaniel Harlow, in full view of anyone who cared to look. She would cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed, commit herself to a path that could only lead to heartbreak. But as she clutched the day's sketches to her chest, as she remembered the way he'd looked at her work, with genuine wonder, the way he'd defended her against her own self-doubt, Clara found that she no longer cared about consequences. For the first time in her life, she was choosing love over safety, hope over wisdom, possibility over prudence. Whatever happened next, she would face it with her eyes wide open, and perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough. The next evening arrived with the weight of destiny pressing down on Clara's shoulders. She had spent the day in a state of nervous agitation, unable to focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. Every sound from the street made her heart race. Every glance from her fellow boarders felt loaded with accusation, as if they could see her intentions written across her face in scarlet letters. Henderson had said nothing directly about Clara's plans for the evening, but her disapproving silence spoke volumes. When Clara asked to borrow a better dress, her own evening wear having been sold months ago to pay for train fare, the older woman had reluctantly offered a deep blue silk that had belonged to her late daughter. "It's too fine for the likes of us," Mrs. Henderson had said as she helped Clara with the tiny buttons that ran up the back. but I suppose if you're determined to make a spectacle of yourself, you might as well look respectable doing it." Now standing before the small mirror in her room, Clara barely recognized herself. The dress transformed her completely, the rich blue bringing out the color of her eyes and the elegant cut, making her appear taller, more graceful. She had pinned her hair up in a style she'd seen in a magazine, leaving a few soft curls to frame her face, and the effect was sophisticated in a way that made her feel like she was playing dress-up in someone else's life. At 5 minutes before 7, she made her way downstairs, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain everyone in the boarding house could hear it. The other residents had gathered in the parlor for their evening ritual of gossip and card games, and conversation stopped entirely when Clara appeared in the doorway. "My," said Mrs. Cassidy, her knitting needles frozen mid-stitch, "don't you look elegant tonight, dear?" "Special occasion?" asked Mr. Thompson, lowering his newspaper with obvious curiosity. "Just dinner." Clara managed her voice barely above a whisper. "Dinner," repeated Mrs. Cassidy, with the kind of emphasis that suggested she understood exactly what sort of dinner it would be. "How lovely for you." Clara escaped before anyone could ask more questions, stepping out into the cool evening air with relief. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, and for a moment she allowed herself to simply breathe and appreciate the beauty of it. Whatever happened tonight, at least, she would have this, the memory of standing on the threshold of possibility, dressed in borrowed silk and feeling more alive than she had in years. The hotel dining room was nearly empty when she arrived, most of Millbrook's residents preferring to take their evening meals at home or in the more casual atmosphere of the local taverns. A single waiter, looking bored and slightly surprised to see a customer, directed her to a table by the large front window where Nathaniel was already waiting. He rose as she approached, and Clara saw her own nervousness reflected in his face, though he hid it better than she did. He had dressed with obvious care. His dark suit was impeccably tailored, his white shirt crisp, his hair neatly combed, but there was a tension in his shoulders that spoke of the same anxiety that was making her hands tremble. "Clara," he said, and her name sounded different in his voice, weighted with significance. "You're beautiful." Heat flooded her cheeks as he held her chair, the simple courtesy somehow more intimate than if he had embraced her. As she settled into her seat, Clara was acutely aware of the picture they presented: a well-dressed gentleman dining with a lady who was clearly not his social equal, their conversation intense and private despite the public setting. "I wasn't certain you'd come," Nathaniel said as he retook his seat across from her. "Neither was I," Clara admitted. "Even walking here, I kept thinking I should turn around, go back to the boarding house, pretend this never happened." "What stopped you?" Clara considered the question, her gaze drifting to the window, where the last rays of sunlight painted the street in golden hues. "Curiosity, I suppose. I wanted to know what it would feel like to stop being afraid just for one evening." "And how does it feel?" Clara looked back at him, taking in the warm brown of his eyes, the way his mouth curved slightly upward, even when he wasn't smiling, the careful attention he was paying to her every word. "Terrifying," she said honestly, "and wonderful." The waiter appeared to take their order clearly, recognizing Nathaniel and making an obvious effort to provide excellent service. Clara chose the simplest items on the menu, not trusting her nervous stomach with anything elaborate, while Nathaniel ordered wine with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to such luxuries. "Tell me about your family," Clara said, when they were alone again, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to fill the charged silence that seemed to crackle between them. "What are they like?" Nathaniel's expression grew more serious. "Complicated," he said after a moment. "My father is a good man in many ways, honest, hard-working, generous with his employees, but he sees the world in very simple terms. There are the things that matter: land, cattle, family, legacy, and everything else is frivolous distraction. And your mother, more sophisticated in her tastes but equally rigid in her expectations. She married beneath her station when she chose my father. and I think she spent their entire marriage trying to make up for it by ensuring that her sons marry appropriately. Nathaniel paused as the waiter returned with their wine, waiting until they were alone again before continuing. They love me in their way, but they love the idea of who I should be more than who I actually am. Clara sipped her wine, feeling the warmth of it spread through her chest. That must be lonely. It is, Nathaniel agreed, though I'm beginning to think loneliness is better than the alternative. What alternative? Living a lie, marrying Miss Patterson, and pretending to be content with a life built on duty rather than desire. Spending 40 years wondering what might have been if I'd had the courage to choose differently. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Clara set down her wine glass with careful precision, her hands not quite steady. Is that what this is about, choosing differently? Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes intense. Partly, but it's more than rebellion, Clara. What I feel for you, it's not some desperate attempt to escape my obligations. It's the first real thing I've felt in years. Before Clara could respond, their dinner arrived, and she was grateful for the interruption. The conversation was moving into dangerous territory, touching on feelings and possibilities that she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. They ate in relative silence for several minutes, both seeming to understand that they were approaching some sort of crossroads that would require careful navigation. There's something I need to tell you, Nathaniel said, finally setting down his fork and meeting her gaze directly. About why I came to town, about what my family expects of me. Clara's stomach tightened with dread, but she nodded for him to continue. My younger brother Marcus has fallen in love, Nathaniel began, with the daughter of one of our neighboring ranchers, a genuine love match from what I can tell. But according to family tradition, the eldest son must marry first. My parents have made it clear that Marcus cannot propose until I fulfill my obligations. To Miss Patterson, Clara said quietly. To Miss Patterson. The engagement was arranged years ago, and the wedding is supposed to take place this fall. Marcus is growing desperate. The girl he loves has other suitors, and he's terrified of losing her while he waits for me to do my duty. Clara felt something cold settling in her chest. And you're considering it. The marriage, I mean. I was, Nathaniel admitted, until I met you. Now the thought of marrying anyone else feels impossible, but if I don't... He ran a hand through his hair, disturbing its careful arrangement. If I don't marry Miss Patterson, Marcus may lose his chance at happiness. My parents will be devastated. The family name, the ranch, everything my father built, it could all be jeopardized. Clara stared down at her barely touched dinner, her appetite completely gone. This was what she had been afraid of from the beginning. The reality of his obligations, the impossibility of their situation, the brutal mathematics of love against duty. She had known it was coming, but hearing it stated so plainly still felt like a physical blow. I see, she said, proud of how steady her voice sounded. Do you... Nathaniel reached across the table to cover her hand with his. Because I'm not sure I do. I came to town planning to propose to Miss Patterson next week. It was all arranged, all decided, but now you've met a ruined woman who's made you question everything. Clara finished for him, her tone sharper than she intended. Now I've met a woman who's made me realize what I've been missing. Nathaniel corrected firmly. A woman who's shown me what it means to choose love over convenience, authenticity over approval. You've changed everything, Clara. The intensity in his voice made her look up, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. There was no mistaking the emotion there, no doubting the sincerity of his words. But sincerity didn't change facts, and the facts were as immutable as the mountains that surrounded their valley. What are you saying? She asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. I'm saying that I can't marry Miss Patterson. I'm saying that I'd rather face my family's disappointment than live a lie. I'm saying that if you'll have me, if you can overlook the scandal it will cause and the difficulties we'll face, I want to court you properly." Clara felt the world tilt around her as if the solid ground beneath her chair had suddenly given way. This was what she had hoped for and feared in equal measure, the possibility of something real, something lasting, something that could transform her exile into a new beginning. But the cost would be enormous for both of them. "Your family will disown you," she said. "Possibly. The whole territory will be scandalized. The cattle baron's son choosing a fallen woman over a respectable marriage. Probably. You could lose everything, your inheritance, your position, your future." "I could," Nathaniel agreed. "Or I could gain everything that actually matters. Love, authenticity, a partnership built on choice rather than obligation." He leaned forward, his grip on her hand tightening. "Clara, I've spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, being who other people wanted me to be. I'm tired of it. I want to find out who I am when I'm free to choose." Clara stared at him, seeing not the privileged heir she had first met, but a man willing to risk everything for the chance at genuine happiness. It was terrifying and exhilarating and completely unprecedented in her experience. "What about Marcus?" she asked. "Your brother's happiness?" Nathaniel's expression grew pained. "I've been thinking about that. What if there was another way? What if Marcus could marry first, breaking the tradition but preserving his happiness? It would still be a scandal, but a smaller one. And if I'm already planning to defy convention, you think your parents would accept that? I think my parents might surprise us both if they were forced to choose between losing one son's happiness and losing both sons entirely." Nathaniel's smile was rueful. "Besides, they've always preferred Marcus anyway. He's more like my father, practical, focused on the ranch, uncomplicated by artistic pretensions." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other diners, a family Clara didn't recognize, but who clearly knew Nathaniel. The man nodded respectfully, his wife offered a polite smile, but Clara didn't miss the curious glances that followed. By tomorrow, word of their dinner would be all over town. "We should go," she said quietly. "People are starting to notice." "Let them notice," Nathaniel said, but he signaled for the check anyway. "Clara, I need to know, is there any chance you might consider what I'm proposing? Not just the courtship, but everything that would come with it. The gossip, the difficulties, the uncertainty." Clara looked out the window at the darkening street where gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life like earthbound stars. Everything in her rational mind screamed that this was madness, that she should thank him for a lovely evening and walk away before either of them could be hurt any further. But her heart, that foolish, resilient organ that had survived so much already, was singing with possibility. "I need time," she said finally, "to think, to understand what we'd really be facing." "Of course." Nathaniel stood and helped her from her chair, his hand lingering on her arm. "Take all the time you need. But Clara, don't let fear make the decision for you. We've both spent too much time being afraid." They walked back to the boarding house in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken possibilities hanging between them like a bridge they weren't quite ready to cross. At the gate, Nathaniel caught her hand one more time. "Whatever you decide," he said softly, "tonight has been the most honest I've felt in years. Thank you for that." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and hurried into the house before her resolve could crumble. From her window, she watched him walk away down the empty street, his figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. The house was quiet when she crept upstairs, most of the other boarders already retired for the evening. But a light showed under Mrs. Henderson's door, and Clara wasn't surprised when the older woman appeared in the hallway as she passed. "A word, dear." Mrs. Henderson's voice was gentle but firm. Clara followed her into the small sitting room that served as Mrs. Henderson's private parlor, where a fire burned low in the grate and the remnants of tea service sat on a side table. "Sit down, child," Mrs. Henderson said, settling into her favorite chair and gesturing for Clara to take the one opposite. We need to talk. Clara perched on the edge of the chair, still wearing the borrowed blue dress, her hands folded carefully in her lap. If this is about dinner, it's about more than dinner, and you know it. Mrs. Henderson's eyes were kind but serious. Clara, I've watched you these past few days, seen the way you look when that young man is around. I've also lived long enough to recognize when a situation is heading toward disaster. Mrs. Henderson, let me finish. The older woman held up a hand. I know you think I'm being overprotective, maybe even cruel, but I've seen what happens when girls in your position forget themselves with men like Nathaniel Harlow. It never ends well, child, never. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. You don't know him. You don't understand what he's offering. I understand that he's offering you dreams, Mrs. Henderson said gently. Beautiful, impossible dreams that will break your heart when reality intrudes. And reality always intrudes, Clara. Always. What if it doesn't have to? Clara leaned forward, her voice passionate. What if there's a chance, even a small one, that something real could come of this? Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, studying Clara's face in the firelight. Tell me honestly, child, do you love him? The question hit Clara like a physical blow, forcing her to confront feelings she'd been trying to keep at bay. Did she love Nathaniel, or was she simply so starved for kindness and attention that she'd mistaken gratitude for deeper emotion? I think I might, she whispered. I know it's foolish. I know all the reasons it's impossible, but the heart doesn't listen to reason, Mrs. Henderson finished. I know, dear. I was young once too. Something in the older woman's tone made Clara look up sharply. You've been in love with someone unsuitable. Mrs. Henderson's smile was sad and distant. Very unsuitable. A traveling musician who came through town when I was about your age. Handsome as sin and twice as charming, with dreams of seeing the world and making his fortune with his fiddle. What happened? What always happens. He left promising to send for me when he was established somewhere. I waited 2 years before I finally accepted that the promises had been empty. Mrs. Henderson's voice grew quieter. I married Mr. Henderson on the rebound, a good man who deserved better than a wife who was settling for security instead of love. Clara felt her chest tighten with sympathy. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry for me, child. Be smart for yourself. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward, her expression intent. I'm not saying Nathaniel Harlow is a scoundrel like my musician. From what I can see, he's a decent young man with genuine feelings for you. But decent feelings don't overcome impossible circumstances. Love doesn't conquer all, no matter what the poets say. Then what would you have me do? Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been? I'd have you be realistic about what might be, Mrs. Henderson replied. Even if his intentions are honorable, even if he's willing to defy his family for you, what kind of life would you have? Cut off from his world, never quite accepted by yours, watching him sacrifice everything for a love that might not survive the strain of such sacrifice. The words hit home because Clara had been thinking the same things, harboring the same doubts, despite the hope that Nathaniel's proposal had kindled in her heart. She wanted to believe that love could overcome anything, but experience had taught her to be wary of such fairy tale thinking. I need to sleep on it, Clara said finally. Think it through properly. Good girl. Mrs. Henderson rose and kissed Clara's forehead gently. Whatever you decide, know that you'll always have a home here. Don't let anyone, not even a well-meaning young man, make you forget your own worth. Alone in her small room, Clara sat by the window, looking out at the star-filled sky. Somewhere out there, Nathaniel was probably lying awake as she was wrestling with the same impossible questions, the same desperate hopes. The borrowed dress felt heavy on her shoulders, a reminder of the gulf between the life she was living and the life she might choose. 3 days later, the choice was made for them both. Clara was in the garden sketching when the commotion started. Raised voices from the street, the sound of horses being ridden hard, the kind of urgent activity that usually meant trouble. She looked up from her drawing to see a small crowd gathering near the hotel, their faces tense with whatever news was spreading through the group. Mrs. Henderson appeared at the garden gate, her expression grim. "Clara, dear, you'd better come inside. There's news about the Harlow family." Clara's heart lurched. "What kind of news?" "The kind that changes everything," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. "Mr. Harlow, Nathaniel's father, had some sort of seizure yesterday evening. They've called for the doctor from Denver, but—" She shrugged helplessly. "The family is in crisis. All thoughts of weddings and courtships have been set aside." Clara felt the sketch pad slip from her nerveless fingers. "Is he going to be all right?" "No one knows, but Nathaniel rode out this morning back to the ranch. Word is the family is rallying around, making preparations for the worst." Standing in the garden where she had first met Nathaniel, Clara felt the weight of reality crushing down on her like an avalanche. Whatever tentative future they might have imagined together had just been swept away by circumstances beyond their control. He was needed at home now, needed to be the dutiful son, the responsible heir, the man his family required him to be. The dreams they had shared over dinner 3 nights ago suddenly seemed as insubstantial as morning mist. Real life had intruded just as Mrs. Henderson had predicted it would, and real life demanded sacrifice and duty, and the putting aside of impossible loves. But even as Clara's rational mind accepted the inevitable, her heart refused to let go entirely. Somewhere beyond the mountains, Nathaniel was facing the most difficult moment of his life. And despite everything, despite the impossibility of their situation, despite the wisdom of walking away, she found herself hoping that somehow, someday, he might find a way back to the garden where they had first discovered each other. For now, though, all she could do was wait and hope and try to protect what remained of her battered heart. The fairy tale was over before it had truly begun, but perhaps that was for the best. Real love, Clara was beginning to understand, was more complicated than any story she had ever heard, and infinitely more precious for its rarity. 2 weeks passed without word from the Double H Ranch, and Clara found herself caught in a strange suspension between hope and despair. Each morning she woke expecting news, good or bad, that might clarify her future. Each evening she went to bed with the same questions unanswered, the same uncertainty gnawing at her heart. The town buzzed with rumors about the Harlow patriarch's condition. Some said he was recovering slowly. Others whispered that the family was preparing for a funeral. The one constant in all the stories was that Nathaniel had not left his father's side, had taken on the full burden of managing the ranch, while his father fought for his life. Clara threw herself into her work with desperate intensity, taking on additional sewing projects from the local seamstress, and even accepting a commission to create illustrations for the town's new business directory. The coins she earned were meager, but they represented something precious, the possibility of true independence, of building a life that belonged entirely to herself. It was on a Tuesday morning while she sat in the garden working on a sketch of the courthouse for the directory that Sarah Murphy burst through the gate with news that would change everything. "Clara." Sarah's face was flushed with excitement and exertion. "You'll never believe what I just heard at the post office. The most extraordinary thing." "Sarah, please," Clara said, looking up from her work with weary patience. "I'm not sure I can bear any more extraordinary things just now." "This is different," Sarah insisted, settling beside Clara on the wooden bench. "This isn't gossip or speculation. This is real news straight from the source." Despite herself, Clara felt her pulse quicken. What source? Marcus Harlow himself. "He came into town this morning to pick up supplies and medicines, and he stopped at the post office to send a telegram." Sarah paused, dramatically, clearly savoring her role as messenger. "Clara, his father is going to live. The crisis has passed, and Mr. Harlow is expected to make a full recovery." Clara felt a rush of relief so powerful it left her dizzy. Whatever her own situation, she was genuinely glad that Nathaniel's family would be spared the tragedy of losing their patriarch. "That's wonderful news," she said, though her voice sounded strangely flat to her own ears. "That's not the extraordinary part," Sarah continued, her eyes bright with barely contained excitement. "Marcus also told Mrs. Patterson, you know how she likes to involve herself in everyone's business, that there's going to be a double wedding at the ranch next month." Clara's pencil slipped from her fingers, leaving a dark mark across her sketch. A double wedding. Marcus and his sweetheart, and Sarah paused, watching Clara's face carefully, and Nathaniel and Miss Patterson. It seems the family has decided that life is too precious to waste on delays and traditions. Both brothers are to marry on the same day, regardless of age or precedence. The words hit Clara like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs and making her vision blur at the edges. She had known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it, as much as anyone could prepare for heartbreak, but the reality was still devastating. "I see," she managed, though her voice sounded as if it were coming from very far away. Sarah reached out to touch her arm gently. "I'm sorry, Clara. I know you'd grown fond of Mr. Harlow and he of you, but perhaps it's for the best. A clean break, no lingering hopes or what-ifs." Clara nodded mechanically, though she couldn't trust herself to speak. Sarah was right, of course. This was exactly what needed to happen, what Clara had known would happen from the very beginning. Nathaniel was fulfilling his obligations, choosing duty over desire, securing his family's future and his brother's happiness. It was the right choice, the only choice he could make under the circumstances. So why did it feel like her heart was being torn from her chest? "There's more," Sarah said softly, and something in her tone made Clara look up sharply. "More." Marcus said something else to Mrs. Patterson, something about how the weddings needed to happen quickly because Nathaniel was planning to leave for Europe afterward, a sort of extended honeymoon, but also— Sarah hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with what she was about to reveal. Also because he'd told the family he needed to get away from Colorado for a while, to forget certain complications that had arisen. The words were like salt in an open wound, but Clara forced herself to remain composed. Of course, Nathaniel would want to leave. Of course, he would need distance from the place where he'd almost thrown away everything for an impossible love. She couldn't blame him for that, even if the knowledge that she was something he needed to forget cut her to the bone. "I understand," Clara said quietly. "Thank you for telling me." Sarah studied her face with obvious concern. "Are you all right? You've gone terribly pale." "I'm fine," Clara lied, gathering her sketching supplies with hands that trembled only slightly. "I have work to finish." She escaped to her room before the tears could start, before the careful composure she'd maintained could crumble entirely. Once alone, she allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of grief. 10 minutes to cry for the future that would never be, for the love that had bloomed and died in the space of a few precious weeks, for the man who had shown her what it meant to be truly seen and valued. When the tears stopped, Clara washed her face, pinned her hair back into its usual severe style, and returned to her work. There were illustrations to finish, bills to pay, a life to rebuild from whatever pieces remained. She had survived worse than this. She would survive this too. The following week brought an unexpected visitor to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house. Clara was in the kitchen helping with the evening meal preparation when Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, her expression carefully neutral. "Clara dear, there's someone here to see you," she said, "a young man." Clara's heart leaped before common sense could intervene. "Nathaniel, Marcus Harlow," Mrs. Henderson corrected gently. "He's waiting in the parlor." Clara set down the dish towel she'd been holding, her mind racing. Why would Marcus want to see her? What could Nathaniel's brother possibly have to say to a woman his family would never acknowledge? Marcus was standing by the parlor window when Clara entered, his hat in his hands and his expression grave. He was taller than Nathaniel, but leaner, with the same brown eyes but a more serious demeanor. Where Nathaniel carried himself with easy confidence, Marcus seemed weighted down by responsibility. "Miss Rowden," he said, turning as she entered, "Thank you for seeing me. I know this is—" irregular. Mr. Harlow. Clara remained near the doorway, suddenly conscious of her simple work dress and flour-dusted apron. How may I help you? Marcus glanced around the small parlor, taking in the worn furniture and faded wallpaper with the assessment of someone accustomed to much finer surroundings. But there was no judgment in his gaze, only a kind of weary understanding. I wanted to speak with you about my brother, he said without preamble. About Nathaniel. Clara felt her chest tighten. I'm not sure that's appropriate, Mr. Harlow, under the circumstances. The circumstances are exactly why we need to talk, Marcus replied firmly. Miss Rowden, Clara, may I call you Clara? I know about the time you spent with Nathaniel. I know about his feelings for you, and I suspect I know something about yours for him. Heat flooded Clara's cheeks. I don't think... Please, Marcus interrupted, and there was something almost desperate in his voice. Let me speak plainly. My brother is about to make the biggest mistake of his life, and I think you're the only person who might be able to stop him. Clara stared at him confused. I don't understand. The wedding is exactly the mistake I'm talking about, Marcus said grimly. Clara Nathaniel doesn't love Miss Patterson. He's never even met her properly. This marriage is pure obligation, nothing more. I know that, Clara said quietly, but it's his obligation to fulfill. His duty to your family. Is it? Marcus moved closer, his brown eyes intense. Or is it just fear dressed up as duty? Fear of disappointing our parents? Fear of choosing his own path? Fear of fighting for what he actually wants? Clara felt something shift in her chest. A tiny spark of hope that she tried desperately to extinguish. It doesn't matter what he wants. The reality is that our father nearly died, and it changed everything. Marcus interrupted. Do you know what he said when he was recovering, when he thought he might not live to see another sunrise? Clara shook her head, not trusting herself to speak. He said his only regret was that he'd spent so much time worrying about duty and tradition that he'd forgotten to make sure his sons knew how to be happy. Marcus's voice grew softer. He said he didn't want us to make the same mistake he had, choosing what was expected over what was desired. The words hit Clara like a thunderbolt. Your father said that more than that. When Nathaniel told him about you, about meeting you, about the feelings he'd developed, our father didn't react the way any of us expected. He didn't rage or threaten or lecture about family honor. Marcus paused, his expression almost wondering. He asked if Nathaniel loved you. Clara's breath caught. And when Nathaniel said yes, our father asked if you loved him in return. When Nathaniel said he thought you might, our father told him he was a fool if he let convention stand in the way of genuine love. The room seemed to spin around Clara. This was so far from what she had expected, so different from the story Sarah had told her that she could barely process the words. But the wedding, she managed. The arrangements are happening because Nathaniel is convinced that choosing you would destroy the family, Marcus explained. He thinks our parents would disown him, that I would lose my chance at happiness, that the ranch would suffer. He's sacrificing himself on the altar of what he thinks we need from him. And you're saying that's not true. Marcus ran a hand through his hair, disturbing its careful arrangement. I'm saying that what we need from him is honesty, authenticity, the courage to be himself instead of the man he thinks we require him to be. He looked directly into Clara's eyes. I'm saying that if he marries Miss Patterson, while his heart belongs to you, it will destroy him. And destroying himself won't help anyone. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. What are you asking me to do? Fight for him, Marcus said simply. The way he should be fighting for you. Show him that love is worth the risk, that happiness is worth the scandal, that a life built on truth is better than one built on obligation. I can't, Clara whispered. You don't understand what it would mean for him to choose me. The gossip, the social consequences. The gossip will fade, Marcus interrupted. Social consequences can be overcome, but regret lasts forever, Clara, and I can't watch my brother spend the rest of his life regretting the choice he's about to make. Clara sank into the nearest chair, overwhelmed by the possibility Marcus was offering her. Even if what you're saying is true, even if your parents would accept me, there's still Miss Patterson to consider, her feelings, her reputation. Miss Patterson is relieved, Marcus said, and his tone was so matter-of-fact that Clara looked up in surprise. Relieved. She's in love with someone else. Has been for years, a young lawyer in Denver who's been waiting for her to be free of the arrangement with Nathaniel. Marcus smiled for the first time since entering the room. If anything, she'll be grateful to escape a marriage she never wanted. Clara felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. Everything she had believed about the situation, every assumption she had made about the consequences of defying convention was being turned upside down. This is all very sudden, she said weakly. Love usually is, Marcus replied. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Before Clara could answer, the sound of horses on the street outside drew their attention to the window. Marcus looked out and his expression changed, becoming simultaneously more serious and more hopeful. He's here, Marcus said quietly. Who's here? Nathaniel. I told him I was coming to see you, and I think he couldn't stand the thought of letting someone else speak for his heart. Marcus moved toward the door, then paused. Clara, whatever happens next, remember that love requires courage from both people. Don't let fear make your choice for you. Clara heard the front door open, heard Mrs. Henderson's startled exclamation, heard the sound of boots on the wooden floor of the hallway. And then Nathaniel was standing in the parlor doorway, his hair disheveled from hard riding, his clothes dusty with travel, his brown eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. Clara, he said, and her name sounded like a prayer in his voice. Marcus slipped past his brother with a meaningful look. I'll be waiting outside, he said to Nathaniel. Don't take too long. We have a wedding to stop. And then Clara and Nathaniel were alone facing each other across the small parlor that suddenly felt charged with electricity. Neither spoke for a long moment, both seeming overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. I thought you were marrying Miss Patterson, Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I was going to, Nathaniel admitted. I convinced myself it was the right thing to do, the noble thing. I told myself that loving you was selfish, that choosing you would hurt too many people. And now, Nathaniel stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. Now I realize that the most selfish thing I could do would be to marry Miss Patterson while my heart belongs to you. She deserves better than a husband who's thinking of another woman. My family deserves better than a son who's living a lie. And you, his voice broke slightly, you deserve better than a man who's too much of a coward to fight for what matters most. Clara felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Nathaniel, I love you, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I love your talent, your courage, your refusal to let circumstances define your worth. I love the way you see beauty in broken things, the way you transform pain into art, the way you make me want to be the man I could become instead of settling for the man I've always been. I love you too, Clara whispered, the admission torn from her heart before fear could silence it. I've tried to convince myself it was impossible, but love doesn't listen to logic. Nathaniel finished, moving closer still. Clara, I know I'm asking you to take an enormous risk. I know there will be gossip and social complications and moments when we'll both wonder if we've made a terrible mistake. But I also know that I can't spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to choose love over convention. Clara looked into his face, seeing the same desperate hope she felt reflected in his brown eyes. This was the moment Mrs. Henderson had warned her about, the point where she would have to choose between safety and possibility, between the known hardships of her current life and the unknown challenges of a future with Nathaniel. What about your family? She asked. Your responsibilities. My family wants me to be happy, Nathaniel said. It took almost losing my father for me to understand that, but it's true. As for responsibilities, my greatest responsibility is to live authentically, to be the man worthy of the woman I love. And Miss Patterson, Nathaniel's smile was rueful. According to Marcus, she's been waiting for years for an excuse to escape our engagement. Apparently, she's as trapped by convention as we've been. Clara felt the last of her resistance crumbling. Everything she had believed about their situation, every obstacle that had seemed insurmountable, was being revealed as less solid than she had imagined. Not unreal, there would still be challenges, still be people who disapproved, still be moments of doubt and difficulty, but not insurmountable. "Clara," Nathaniel said, dropping to one knee beside her chair and taking her hands in his. "I'm not asking you to marry me today, or even soon. I'm asking you to let me court you properly, publicly, with the full knowledge and support of my family. I'm asking for the chance to prove that love can be stronger than convention, that happiness can be worth whatever price we have to pay for it." Clara looked down at their joined hands, at the way his strong fingers intertwined with hers, and felt something settle into place in her chest. This was what she had been afraid to hope for, not just love, but love freely chosen and openly declared love that didn't require hiding or shame or the constant fear of discovery. "Yes," she said, the word emerging as barely more than a breath. "Yes, I'll let you court me. Yes, I'll take the risk. Yes to all of it." Nathaniel's face transformed with joy, and he rose to pull her into his arms, holding her against his chest, as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Clara buried her face in his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of cedar and sage and mountain air, feeling the solid reality of his embrace chase away the last of her fears. "There's something else," Nathaniel said, pulling back to look into her face. "Something I want to offer you, regardless of what happens between us personally." "What?" "A showing for your art." Nathaniel's eyes were bright with excitement. "My mother has connections with several galleries in Denver and San Francisco. She's agreed to help arrange an exhibition of your work to give you the recognition you deserve." Clara stared at him in shock. "Your mother knows about my art. I showed her some of your sketches, the ones you gave me permission to keep. She was impressed, doesn't begin to cover it. She said you have more natural talent than most of the artists she's seen in the finest galleries." Nathaniel's smile was radiant. "Clara, this could be the beginning of a real career for you. Financial independence, artistic recognition, everything you've dreamed of. But why would she do that for me? Because she believes in supporting genuine talent, regardless of its source. And because," Nathaniel's expression grew more serious, "because she understands that the woman her son loves deserves every opportunity to flourish." Clara felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered, not just love, but also the chance to pursue her art professionally, to build a life that honored both her heart and her talents. It was more than she had ever dared to hope for, more than she had thought possible when she'd first arrived in Millbrook, with nothing but heartbreak and a few sketches to her name. "When?" she asked. "The showing in 3 months, if you agree. That gives you time to prepare additional pieces to create a body of work that truly represents your abilities." Nathaniel paused. "And it gives us time to navigate the social complexities of our courtship, to prove to anyone who doubts us that this is real and lasting." Clara nodded, feeling dazed by the speed with which her entire future was being rewritten. "I can't quite believe this is happening." "Believe it," Nathaniel said firmly. "Believe in us, in what we can build together. Believe that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones most worth pursuing." From outside, Marcus's voice called through the window. "Nathaniel, if we're going to stop this wedding, we need to leave soon." Nathaniel laughed, the sound full of relief and joy. "He's right. Miss Patterson is expecting us to explain the situation properly, and I suspect she'll have her own celebrations to plan once she's free." Clara felt a bubble of laughter rise in her own chest. This is all quite mad, you know. The best things usually are, Nathaniel agreed. Clara, will you come with us to the ranch, I mean? My parents are eager to meet you properly, and I think it's time we stopped hiding what we mean to each other. The invitation was everything Clara had never dared to hope for. Acceptance welcomed the chance to meet Nathaniel's family as his chosen partner rather than a shameful secret. It was terrifying and wonderful and completely unprecedented in her experience. I'll need to pack, she said practically, though her heart was singing with possibility. Of course, we'll wait. As Clara hurried upstairs to gather her belongings, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above her washstand. The woman looking back at her was transformed, her eyes bright with hope, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her entire bearing radiating the confidence of someone who had finally stopped running from happiness. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway as Clara packed her few possessions into the battered trunk that had carried her from Kansas. So, the older woman said, settling onto the narrow bed, I gather our young Mr. Harlow has offered you a different sort of future than the one we discussed. He has, Clara confirmed, folding her best dress carefully between layers of tissue paper. Mrs. Henderson, I know you think I'm making a mistake. Actually, Mrs. Henderson interrupted, I think you're being very brave. Braver than I was at your age. She was quiet for a moment, watching Clara pack. I've seen that young man these past few weeks, seen the way he looks when he speaks of you. Whatever else happens, Clara, that's real love. The kind that comes once in a lifetime, if we're lucky. Clara paused in her packing to look at the older woman. Do you really think so? I think, Mrs. Henderson said with a smile, that sometimes convention needs to be challenged. Sometimes the heart knows better than society what's right and proper. And sometimes a woman has to be willing to risk everything for the chance at everything she's ever wanted. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes. Thank you for everything, for giving me a place to land when I had nowhere else to go, for protecting me when I needed protecting, for caring enough to warn me against heartbreak. And for knowing when to stop warning and start encouraging, Mrs. Henderson added. Now go, child. Your future is waiting for you downstairs, and futures have a way of growing impatient if kept waiting too long. Clara hugged the older woman tightly, then gathered her trunk and headed downstairs to where Nathaniel and Marcus were waiting. The afternoon sun streamed through the parlor windows, painting everything in golden light that reminded Clara of that first magical afternoon in the meadow when everything had begun. Ready? Nathaniel asked, taking her trunk and offering her his arm. Ready, Clara said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As they walked out of the boarding house together, Clara and Nathaniel, side by side, Marcus following with her art supplies, Clara felt as if she were walking out of one life and into another entirely. Behind them lay months of hiding and uncertainty, and the painful belief that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Ahead lay challenges and possibilities in equal measure, but also the chance to build something real and lasting with a man who saw her worth and wasn't afraid to fight for it. The carriage ride to the Double H Ranch passed in a blur of conversation and laughter, and the gradual dissolving of barriers that had seemed insurmountable just hours before. As they drew closer to the ranch, Clara caught her first glimpse of the place that might become her new home. A sprawling complex of buildings nestled against the foothills, with pastures full of cattle stretching as far as the eye could see. It's beautiful, she breathed, and Nathaniel's answering smile was radiant with pride and hope. Wait until you see it at sunset, he said. The whole sky turns gold and rose, and the mountains look like they're on fire. It's the most beautiful sight in Colorado. Clara squeezed his hand, thinking of all the sunsets they might watch together, all the mornings they might greet side by side, all the years they might have to explore the depths of the love they had discovered in a boarding house garden. It was more than she had ever dared to dream, and infinitely more precious for having been nearly lost. The future spread before them like an uncharted territory full of promise and possibility, and the kind of happiness that could only be built by two people willing to risk everything for love. Clara was ready for the adventure. The Double H ranch house rose before them like a promise fulfilled, its wide porches and tall windows speaking of prosperity earned through hard work and careful stewardship. As their carriage rolled up the circular drive, Clara caught glimpses of the life she might be joining: ranch hands, tending horses in the corrals, women hanging laundry in the mountain breeze, children playing in the yard of what must be the foreman's house. It was a world entirely different from anything she had known, yet something about its purposeful energy felt welcoming. Nathaniel's parents were waiting on the front porch, and Clara's first sight of them challenged every assumption she had made about their likely reception. James Harlow was a tall, weathered man whose recent brush with mortality had left him thinner but somehow more present, more aware of the precious nature of each moment. His wife Eleanor stood beside him, a woman whose Boston breeding showed in her posture and dress, but whose eyes held a warmth that spoke of hard-won wisdom about what truly mattered in life. "Father, Mother," Nathaniel said, as he helped Clara from the carriage, his voice carrying a mixture of nervousness and determination. "I'd like you to meet Clara Rowden." Clara felt her heart hammering as she approached the porch, acutely conscious of her simple traveling dress and the disparity between her circumstances and theirs. But when Eleanor Harlow stepped forward with a genuine smile and extended her hands in welcome, Clara felt some of her tension ease. "Miss Rowden," Eleanor said warmly, taking Clara's hands in her own. "We've heard so much about you. Nathaniel showed us some of your artwork, and I must say you have extraordinary talent." "Thank you, Mrs. Harlow," Clara managed, surprised by the sincerity in the older woman's voice. "You're very kind." "I'm honest," Eleanor replied, echoing her son's favorite phrase. "Kindness has nothing to do with it. Art of that caliber deserves recognition." James Harlow stepped forward, then his assessing gaze taking in Clara's appearance, with the thoroughness of a man accustomed to evaluating livestock and land deals. But when he spoke, his voice was gentle. "Miss Rowden, my son tells me you've had a difficult time of it recently. I hope you'll find the Double H a place where you can heal and perhaps discover new possibilities." The unexpected kindness in his words made Clara's throat tight with emotion. "Thank you, sir. I appreciate your hospitality more than I can express." "Nonsense," James said briskly. "Nathaniel's happiness is important to us, and if you make him happy, then you're welcome here. It's as simple as that." Marcus, who had been unloading Clara's belongings from the carriage, approached with a grin that transformed his usually serious face. "Besides, wait until you meet Rebecca. She's been beside herself with excitement ever since she heard Nathaniel had found someone who shares his appreciation for art and beauty." "Rebecca," Clara asked. "My intended—" Marcus explained, his entire demeanor softening at the mention of her name. "Rebecca Chen. Her family owns the neighboring ranch to the east. She's been waiting so patiently for our engagement to be announced, and now—" he shrugged happily. "Now everything can finally move forward as it should." Eleanor linked her arm through Clara's as they walked toward the house. "Rebecca is a wonderful girl, very practical and down-to-earth, but with a deep appreciation for the finer things. I think you'll like her enormously." The interior of the ranch house was as impressive as its exterior, but Clara was surprised by how welcoming it felt despite its grandeur. The rooms were large and well-appointed, but they were clearly meant for living rather than display. Books and art filled every available space, comfortable chairs invited long conversations, and windows everywhere framed the spectacular mountain views. "I'll have Maria prepare the blue room for you," Eleanor said as they entered the main hall. "It has the best light for artistic work, and I thought you might appreciate the view of the aspen grove." Clara felt overwhelmed by their kindness. "Mrs. Harlow, I don't want to impose—" "You're not imposing," Eleanor said firmly. "You're joining our family, and family members don't impose. They belong." The simple declaration brought tears to Clara's eyes. After months of feeling like an outsider everywhere she went, the idea of belonging somewhere, of being welcomed, not despite her past but as part of her future, was almost too wonderful to believe. "Come," Nathaniel said, taking her arm gently. "Let me show you the studio." "Studio? Mother had it prepared based on the artwork you showed me," he explained, leading her through the house toward what had once been a formal dining room. "She thought you might need proper space to work." When Nathaniel opened the door, Clara gasped. The room had been transformed into an artist's dream: easels positioned to catch the best light, tables for supplies, even a comfortable chair for resting between sessions. Art supplies that must have cost more than Clara earned in months were arranged with careful precision, and the north-facing windows provided the kind of steady, even light that every artist craved. This is incredible," Clara breathed, moving into the room as if she were entering a cathedral. "I've never had anything like this." "Consider it a wedding gift," Eleanor said from the doorway, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "An advance on a wedding gift anyway." Clara spun around, her cheeks flaming. "Miss Harlow, we're not even properly engaged." "Yet," Nathaniel said softly, and something in his voice made Clara's heart skip. "But if you'll have me, Clara, I'd like to remedy that situation as soon as possible." The room fell silent except for the ticking of a mantel clock and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the pastures. Clara felt as if the world had stopped turning, as if this moment was balanced on the edge of forever, waiting for her answer to tip it in one direction or another. "Are you asking me to marry you?" she whispered. "I'm asking if you would consider accepting my proposal when I make it properly," Nathaniel said, his brown eyes serious and tender. "With your permission, I'd like to court you in full view of our families and the community. I'd like to prove to everyone, including ourselves, that what we feel is real and lasting. And then when we're both ready, when we've answered all the questions and overcome all the obstacles, I'd like to ask you to be my wife." Clara looked around the room at the studio, prepared with such care, at the family that had welcomed her with open arms, at the man who was offering her not just love, but a future built on mutual respect and shared dreams. It was everything she had never dared to hope for, wrapped up in a package that seemed too good to be true. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to all of it." Nathaniel's face lit up with joy, and he crossed the room in 3 quick strides to pull her into his arms. This time, with his family watching and their blessing implicit in their presence, the embrace felt different, not stolen or secret, but claimed and celebrated. When he kissed her forehead gently, Clara felt as if she were being welcomed home after a long, difficult journey. "Well," James said gruffly, though his eyes were suspiciously bright, "I suppose we'd better start planning a wedding, or rather 2 weddings. Unless what?" Marcus asked. "Unless you'd consider making it a double ceremony after all," Eleanor suggested, her voice carefully casual. "Not the arranged marriage we originally planned, but a celebration of 2 brothers marrying for love. It would be quite romantic, don't you think?" Clara felt Nathaniel's arms tighten around her. "What do you think?" he asked softly. "Would you be willing to share your wedding day?" "With Marcus and Rebecca, I'd be honored," Clara said honestly. "But are you sure after everything that's happened?" "I'm sure," Nathaniel said firmly. "I'm sure about you, about us, about the life we're going to build together. The only thing I'm not sure about is how I managed to be lucky enough to find you." The weeks that followed passed in a whirlwind of preparation and discovery. Clara threw herself into her art with renewed passion, working in the beautiful studio Eleanor had created for her and finding inspiration in every aspect of ranch life. She sketched the cowboys working with the cattle, captured the play of light on the mountain peaks at different times of day, and created portrait studies of the family that welcomed her with increasing warmth. Rebecca Chen proved to be everything Marcus had promised, and more. She was a practical, intelligent young woman with a quick wit and a generous heart. and she and Clara became fast friends almost immediately. Rebecca had been raised on a ranch and understood the rhythms of this life in ways that Clara was still learning, but she never made Clara feel ignorant or out of place. "The thing about ranch life," Rebecca explained one afternoon as they sat in the garden planning wedding details, "is that it requires everyone to be useful. There's no room for ornamental people here, but usefulness comes in many forms. My mother manages the household accounts and tends to the sick. My father breeds the finest horses in 3 counties, and she grinned, "I have a talent for organizing and a complete inability to be impressed by masculine bluster, very useful qualities when dealing with cowboys and cattle barons." "And what about me?" Clara asked. "What useful role could I possibly fill?" "Are you serious?" Rebecca stared at her in amazement. "Clara, you're bringing beauty into this world. You're creating things that will outlast all of us, capturing moments and emotions that would otherwise be lost forever. If that's not useful, I don't know what is." The validation from someone she was coming to love like a sister meant more to Clara than she could express. For so long she had thought of her art as a pleasant hobby, at best a selfish indulgence at worst. To have it valued and celebrated, to see it as a legitimate contribution to the family and community she was joining, felt revolutionary. As the wedding date approached, Clara found herself marveling at how thoroughly her life had been transformed. The woman who had arrived in Millbrook with nothing but heartbreak and a few sketches was becoming someone new, still herself, but a version of herself that had been allowed to flourish. Her art was improving daily under the influence of proper supplies and unlimited subject matter. Her confidence was growing as she found her place within the Harlow family dynamics, and her love for Nathaniel was deepening as she watched him in his natural environment, saw how he cared for the ranch and its people, witnessed his transformation from dutiful heir to authentic man. The community's reaction to the engagement had been everything they had feared and less than they had expected. There was gossip, certainly, and some disapproval from the more rigid members of Millbrook society, but there was also support from unexpected quarters. Mrs. Henderson had made it clear that anyone who criticized Clara in her hearing would be asked to leave her establishment. Several of the ranch wives had gone out of their way to welcome Clara into their circle, and even some of the men who worked for James Harlow had expressed approval of their boss's son choosing love over obligation. "The thing is," Tom Bradley, the ranch foreman, had told Nathaniel within Clara's hearing, "a man's got to be able to respect his wife if he's going to work alongside her for 40 years. And from what I can see, Miss Clara's got the kind of backbone this place needs. She'll do just fine." One evening, 3 weeks before the wedding, Clara was in her studio working on a special project, a landscape painting that would be her wedding gift to Nathaniel, when Eleanor knocked softly on the door. "May I come in?" the older woman asked. "I have something I'd like to show you." Eleanor entered carrying a large flat package wrapped in tissue paper. "This arrived today from San Francisco," she explained, setting the package on one of the work tables. "I think you'll find it interesting." Clara set down her paintbrush and approached the package with curiosity. When she unwrapped it, she gasped. Inside was a framed poster advertising an upcoming art exhibition at one of San Francisco's most prestigious galleries. At the top, in elegant script, were the words, "New Voices of the American West," and prominently featured among the participating artists was her own name, Clara Rowden. "How is this possible?" Clara whispered, staring at the poster in disbelief. "I sent some of your work to a friend of mine who owns the gallery," Eleanor explained. "Eugenie Hartford. We were at school together in Boston many years ago. She's made quite a name for herself in the art world, and when she saw your sketches and paintings, she insisted on including you in this exhibition." Clara felt dizzy with the magnitude of what she was seeing. "My work is going to be displayed in a real gallery." "Not just displayed," Eleanor said with obvious pride. "Featured. Eugenie says you have a unique voice and perspective that the art world needs to hear. She's particularly excited about your Ranch Life series. Apparently, most Western art is done by men who focus on the dramatic and violent aspects of frontier life. Your work shows the beauty and humanity of it, and that's something very special. I don't know what to say, Clara managed, still staring at the poster. Thank you doesn't seem adequate. Say you'll go, Eleanor suggested. The exhibition opens 2 months after your wedding, which would make it a perfect honeymoon destination. San Francisco is a beautiful city, and I think you and Nathaniel would both enjoy experiencing it together. Clara looked up from the poster to meet Eleanor's eyes. You've planned all of this, haven't you? The studio, the exhibition, the opportunities. I've simply opened doors, Eleanor said gently. You're the one with the talent and determination to walk through them. I'm just making sure those doors are available when you're ready. The older woman paused, her expression growing more serious. Clara, I want you to understand something. When Nathaniel first told us about you, about his feelings for you, my initial reaction was concern, not because of your past, everyone has a past, but because I was afraid he was making an emotional decision that he might regret later. Clara felt her heart sink. And now I know better, Eleanor said firmly. I've watched you these past weeks, seen how you fit into our family, observed how you and Nathaniel interact when you think no one is looking. What you have together is real and rare and worth fighting for. More than that, you've been good for him. You've helped him find the courage to be himself instead of the person he thought we wanted him to be. Tears pricked at Clara's eyes. He's been good for me too, better than good. He's helped me believe that I'm worth more than my mistakes. You are, Eleanor said simply, and I'm proud to welcome you into our family. 2 days before the wedding, Clara received an unexpected visitor. She was in the garden cutting flowers for the ceremony when Maria, the housekeeper, approached with news that someone was waiting to see her in the front parlor. A young woman, Maria explained, says her name is Sarah Murphy, and she's come from town with news that can't wait. Clara found Sarah pacing the parlor, her face flushed with excitement and exertion from the long ride to the ranch. Clara, Sarah exclaimed when she entered, thank goodness you're here. I have the most extraordinary news, and I couldn't wait until the wedding to share it. What is it? Clara asked, settling into a chair and gesturing for Sarah to do the same. It's about your father, Sarah said, her eyes bright with barely contained excitement. Clara, he's in Denver. He came looking for you. Clara felt the world tilt around her. My father, that's impossible. He disowned me. That's what I thought too, but I heard it straight from Mrs. Patterson, who got it from her cousin who lives in Denver. Your father arrived there 3 days ago asking about you, trying to find out where you'd gone. Apparently he's been searching for you for months. Clara stared at Sarah, her mind struggling to process this information. Why would he be looking for me now after all this time? His wife left him, Sarah said bluntly. Ran off with a traveling salesman, taking most of their savings with her. But that's not the important part. The important part is what he told Mrs. Patterson's cousin when he was asking about you. Which was? Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to an almost whisper. He said he made the biggest mistake of his life when he cast you out. He said he'd let grief and pride and that woman's poison turn him against his own daughter, and he's been regretting it every day since. He said he doesn't expect your forgiveness, but he wants to try to make amends if it's not too late. Clara felt tears streaming down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. For over a year, she had carried the pain of her father's rejection like a stone in her chest. She had convinced herself that she didn't care about his approval anymore, that she had moved beyond the need for his love. But hearing that he regretted his choice, that he was actively seeking her out, cracked something open inside her that she hadn't realized was still broken. Where is he now? She managed to ask. Still in Denver, as far as anyone knows. Mrs. Patterson's cousin gave him your last known address, the boarding house in Millbrook, but Mrs. Henderson told him you'd moved on without saying where. She was protecting you, I think, not sure if his intentions were good. Clara nodded, grateful for Mrs. Henderson's caution, even as she felt the desperate urge to see her father to understand what had changed, to explore the possibility of healing the deepest wound her exile had created. "I have to go to him," she said suddenly. "I have to see him, talk to him, too." "Clara, the wedding is in 2 days." "I know." Clara stood up, her mind racing. "But I can't get married carrying this burden. I need to face my father to understand what this means before I can fully commit to my new life." Sarah looked uncertain. "Are you sure? What if it's not what you hope? What if he hurts you again?" "Then at least I'll know," Clara said. "At least I'll have tried. But if there's a chance for reconciliation, a chance to heal this breach." She took a deep breath. "I have to take it." Within an hour, Clara had explained the situation to Nathaniel and his family, and plans were being made for an immediate trip to Denver. Nathaniel insisted on accompanying her despite her protests, that it was something she needed to do alone. "Clara," he said, taking her hands in his and looking directly into her eyes, "I'm going to be your husband in 2 days. Your burdens are my burdens, your joys are my joys. If you're going to face your father, you're not doing it alone." The journey to Denver took the better part of a day, and Clara spent most of it in a state of nervous anticipation. What would she say to the man who had cast her out so cruelly? How could she gauge the sincerity of his regret? What if this was all a mistake, a misunderstanding that would only reopen old wounds? They found her father at a modest hotel near the train station, a man so changed from Clara's memories that she almost didn't recognize him. Reverend Clara Rowden had always been an imposing figure, tall, stern, radiating the kind of moral certainty that made weaker men feel small. The man who answered their knock was gaunt and hollow-eyed, his hair gone completely gray, his posture bent as if by invisible weight. "Clara." His voice was barely a whisper, and when he saw her, tears immediately began streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Oh, my dear child, my dear, dear child." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Ezra stepped forward hesitantly, as if afraid she might flee, and Clara found herself crossing the remaining distance to embrace the father she had thought lost to her forever. They talked for hours in his small hotel room, Nathaniel sitting quietly in a corner chair while father and daughter worked through years of pain and misunderstanding. Ezra spoke of his grief after his first wife's death, of how the woman he had married in his loneliness had slowly poisoned him against his own daughter, of the moment months later when he had realized what he had done and tried to find Clara only to discover she had vanished without a trace. "I failed you," he said, his voice broken with remorse. "I failed as a father and as a Christian man. I let my own pain blind me to yours, and I lost the most precious thing in my life because of it." "Papa," Clara said softly, using the childhood name she hadn't spoken in years. "We both made mistakes. We both said things we can't take back." "But you were the child," Ezra protested. "I was supposed to protect you, to guide you, to love you unconditionally. Instead, I abandoned you when you needed me most." Clara reached out to take her father's hands, noting how thin and frail they had become. "But you're here now. You came looking for me. That means something." "Does it? Can you ever forgive me, Clara? Can you ever trust me again?" Clara looked into her father's eyes, seeing genuine repentance there, but also seeing the years of pain and separation that could never be completely erased. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't a single moment of absolution, but a choice that would have to be made over and over again as they worked to rebuild their relationship. "I can try," she said honestly, "if you can accept that I'm not the same person I was when I left Kansas. If you can understand that I've built a new life here, found love and purpose, and a family that has welcomed me completely." Ezra's gaze moved to Nathaniel, who had been sitting silently throughout their conversation. "And you, young man, what are your intentions toward my daughter?" Nathaniel stood and moved closer, his posture respectful but confident. "I intend to marry her, sir, tomorrow if she'll still have me after today's revelations. I intend to love her and protect her and support her dreams for the rest of my life." And her past, the scandal that drove her from Kansas. Her past made her who she is, Nathaniel said simply. And who she is the woman I love. I wouldn't change a single moment of her journey if it meant she might have become someone else. Ezra studied Nathaniel for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You'll do, he said gruffly. You'll do very well indeed. Papa, Clara said, her voice tentative, would you, that is, if you don't have other obligations, would you consider staying for the wedding? It would mean everything to me to have you there. Fresh tears spilled down Ezra's cheeks. You would want that, after everything. I would want that, Clara confirmed. Very much. The wedding day dawned clear and bright with the kind of crystalline mountain air that made every color more vivid and every sound more distinct. The ceremony was held in the garden behind the ranch house, with the mountains providing a spectacular backdrop, and the entire community gathered to witness the double celebration. Clara wore Eleanor's wedding dress, altered to fit her smaller frame, but retaining all of its elegant simplicity. Rebecca was radiant in a gown of her own family's silk, her dark hair crowned with flowers from the ranch garden. The two couples stood side by side before Reverend Matthews from town, with Ezra Rowden beside him to offer additional blessings for his daughter's marriage. As Clara listened to Nathaniel speak, his vows, promises of love and fidelity and partnership that would last until death and beyond, she felt as if her heart might burst with the fullness of it all. This man who had seen her at her lowest point and chosen to love her anyway, this family that had welcomed her with open arms, this father who had traveled hundreds of miles to ask her forgiveness, this community that had learned to see past scandal to the woman beneath it, was more than she had ever dared to dream. When it came time for her own vows, Clara looked into Nathaniel's brown eyes and spoke from the deepest part of her heart. Nathaniel, you taught me that love doesn't require perfection, only honesty. You showed me that the future can be more beautiful than the past was painful. You gave me the courage to stop running from happiness and start running toward it instead. I promise to love you with all the passion and creativity and determination I possess. I promise to be your partner in all things, your comfort in sorrow, your companion in joy. I promise to choose you every day for the rest of my life. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them married and Nathaniel kissed her in front of God and their gathered families, Clara felt as if she were being born again, not the harsh, judgmental rebirth that religion had offered her in the past, but a gentle transformation into the person she was always meant to become. The celebration that followed lasted well into the night, with music and dancing and more food than the assembled crowd could possibly consume. Clara danced with her new husband, with her father, with Marcus and James, and even some of the ranch hands who had screwed up their courage to ask the new Mrs. Harlow for a turn around the makeshift dance floor. But the moment that stayed with her forever came near the end of the evening, when she and Nathaniel slipped away from the party to walk alone in the garden where they had first begun to know each other. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the sound of laughter and music drifted on the mountain breeze. Any regrets? Nathaniel asked, pulling her close as they stood among the roses that Eleanor tended with such care. Clara looked up at the man who had become her husband, then around at the ranch that was now her home, then back toward the house where their families were celebrating the love that had overcome every obstacle placed in its path. Only one, she said softly. Nathaniel's expression grew concerned. What? I regret that it took so much pain to bring us together, Clara said. I regret that we couldn't have found each other sooner under easier circumstances. But then we wouldn't be who we are, Nathaniel pointed out. Your struggles made you strong and compassionate and determined to create beauty in the world. My struggles made me question everything I thought I knew about duty and happiness. If we had met as different people, we might not have recognized what we had. Clara considered this, then smiled. You're right as usual. Everything happened exactly as it needed to happen to bring us to this moment. To this moment, Nathaniel agreed, kissing her forehead gently, and to all the moments yet to come. 5 years later, Clara stood in her studio at the ranch, putting the finishing touches on a painting that would be displayed in her upcoming exhibition in New York. The room was filled with completed works, landscapes of Colorado's dramatic beauty, portraits of the people who had become her extended family, intimate studies of ranch life that had earned her recognition from coast to coast. Through the window she could see Nathaniel working with a young horse in the corral, his movements patient and confident as he helped the animal learn to trust human touch. At 4 years old, their daughter Rose was perched on the fence, watching her father work, her dark hair caught by the morning breeze, and her brown eyes so like Nathaniel's, bright with curiosity about everything around her. Their son Samuel now, too, was napping in the nursery upstairs, having exhausted himself chasing the barn cats around the yard that morning. The house was full of the comfortable chaos of a growing family, with toys scattered in every room and the sound of children's laughter echoing through the halls. Ezra had moved to Colorado permanently after the wedding, taking over the small church in Millbrook and becoming a beloved figure in the community. His relationship with Clara was still healing, still growing stronger with each shared memory they created, but the foundation of love had proven solid enough to support their reconstruction. Marcus and Rebecca's marriage had produced twin boys who were the terror and delight of the ranch, and they were expecting another child in the fall. The four couples, Nathaniel and Clara, Marcus and Rebecca, had become not just family but best friends, sharing the joys and challenges of building lives rooted in love rather than obligation. James Harlow had made a full recovery from his health scare and was now a doting grandfather who spoiled his grandchildren shamelessly. Eleanor had become Clara's closest confidant and strongest supporter, championing her daughter-in-law's artistic career with the same passion she brought to everything else in her life. As Clara worked on the final details of her painting, a scene of the ranch at sunset, with the mountains glowing like jewels in the distance, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The scandal that had once defined her was now just a chapter in a much larger story, a story about resilience and redemption and the transformative power of love freely given. Rose's laughter drew her attention back to the window where she saw her daughter had climbed down from the fence to help Nathaniel with the horse. The little girl was fearless around the animals, inheriting her father's natural affinity for them, along with her mother's artistic eye and stubborn determination. Like mother, like daughter, Clara murmured to herself, smiling as she watched Rose attempt to mimic Nathaniel's gentle movements. That evening, as they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains they had come to call home, Clara felt the deep contentment that comes from a life lived authentically. There had been struggles along the way, adjusting to ranch life, dealing with the occasional revival of old gossip, balancing her artistic career with motherhood, but each challenge had only strengthened their partnership and deepened their appreciation for what they had built together. "What are you thinking about?" Nathaniel asked, noticing her contemplative mood. "Everything," Clara said, leaning against his shoulder as Rose played with her dolls at their feet and Samuel dozed in her lap. "How we met, how we almost lost each other, how we found our way back. How lucky we are to be sitting here together watching our children grow up in a place where they'll never have to choose between love and duty." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Nathaniel said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "We chose each other, Clara. Every day, through every difficulty, we chose love over fear, hope over despair, possibility over resignation. That's not luck, that's determination." Clara smiled, remembering the terrified young woman who had first arrived in Millbrook, with nothing but heartbreak and a few sketches to her name. That woman could never have imagined the life she was living now, could never have believed that such happiness was possible for someone like her. But perhaps that was the most beautiful part of their story, not that it had ended happily, but that it had begun with such complete hopelessness and still found its way to joy. Love, Clara had learned, wasn't about perfection or worthiness or meeting society's expectations. Love was about seeing someone's true self and choosing to cherish it, flaws and all. Love was about building something beautiful from whatever materials life provided, no matter how broken or unpromising they might seem. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky and the mountain air carried the scent of roses, from Eleanor's garden, Clara closed her eyes and made a silent promise to the woman she had once been, the disgraced preacher's daughter, who had thought her story was over before it had truly begun. She promised to never forget how far she had traveled, how much she had overcome, how precious and fragile and worth fighting for true happiness really was. The future stretched before them like an uncharted landscape full of promise and possibility, and the kind of deep, abiding love that could weather any storm. Clara was ready for whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that she would never again have to face life's challenges alone. She had found her home, her family, her purpose. She had found herself. And in finding all of that, she had discovered that sometimes the most impossible dreams are the ones most worth pursuing, and sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the deepest despair. The girl who had once drawn a stranger in a garden had become a woman who painted her own destiny, and it was more beautiful than anything she could ever have imagined.